Hello. So this is in continuation. This is the second recording for a meetup we had on a movie. Now I think making these recordings for movies is good for at least two reasons. One is that um, we leave something behind in case other people want to consult, look at the resources, take ideas about these specific movies. Also, the other reason is that our movie meetups usually go quite well. The conversation is quite lively, so that's one more reason to try um, and record the ideas we have there. Now, regarding this movie, The Bridge on the River Kwai, the first thing I'd like to say is there is a very nice lecture by um, Ian P. Watts. He gave this lecture in America. He's a British, but he spent many years in American universities, I believe in Stanford. And I will put a link in the description. Now, he might have, he certainly has more writings on this topic. This particular man, he was not only an academic who wrote extensively on literature, um, art, etc., but also he was actually one of the people who were taken as prisoner of war by the Japanese, and I believe he worked in the construction, if not of this particular bridge, but he worked in the same area under the Japanese. So he knew firsthand what was going on. And I will be using extensively what he said in this lecture, which I found very, apart from giving good information, I also found to be very well written. Now, one theme about this movie, let me just say right at the beginning, I think it's a very good movie. I'm just going to focus on the things I think are important for conversation. This doesn't mean I'm trying to diminish either its artistic or historical merit and importance. So you can see this in Wikipedia, you can see this online. There is a lot of discussion about the inaccuracies you have in the movie. So one thing would be British collaboration. I think quite rightly, um, many of the British ex-prisoners of war, and remember the movie was released in 1957, I believe. So there were many of them were still alive, of course. Um, were annoyed by the way they were portrayed, and rightly so. Um, there are several things here. One is that their conditions were depicted as being quite better than they really were, but that's kind of a you can at least contextualize this as a kind of convention in a movie at the time. Usually, war movies try to avoid showing excessive violence, and at least at the beginning of the movie, you can see there is a military cemetery. There is at least a suggestion, and later on, this happens again in the movie that you know things were not good. They just don't want to show the violence in your face and the brutality in your face. But the major problem would be that they show them, they depict them as collaborators, and this did not happen. Okay, this is an invention, and we see how this came about. The second thing, that's a detail, but I think it's kind of interesting to note that at some point there is a conversation in the movie to the effect that the Japanese cannot make a wooden bridge, and that's simply not true. It's just a reflection of the frame of mind at the time that colonial powers like Britain were much better at everything, even at building bridges. And the last one is the explosion. Now, initially, I had some reservations about how the explosion happened because what I know from history, for instance, in the Greek case, the Gorgopotamos Bridge, which was exploded similarly with British commando who came to Greece for this purpose, is that you needed some kind of military, even small but still a military detachment to help you defend the bridge while you were preparing for the explosion. Like in the case of of Gorgopotamos Bridge I mentioned earlier, they had about 100 men to do this task. However, I was told by other people in the meeting that that's not necessarily the case. You could at least try to do it with a small number of people. However, again, it's important to say here the real bridge never exploded this way. The real bridge was destroyed, I understand, by bombardment. And I believe you should check these things on Wikipedia. What I remember is that there is still the bridge was later reconstructed. That is, so it's still standing, but it was indeed destroyed in the war, but definitely not in the way shown in the movie. Now, one of the another very important thing, if we're going to look at the art of the movie, is Colonel Nicholson, which is depicted very nicely by Alec Guinness. The interesting thing is that David Lean, the director, didn't like the way Guinness tried to do that. He thought that Guinness um, should make Nicholson look like a much more boring character, whereas Guinness wanted him to make him, more like naive, idealistic, and somehow funny. Guinness had a good experience in comedies, so he was very good also as a comedy actor. So he brings some of this in this movie. Um, for me, the major revelation about this movie was the realization that the author of the book on which the movie was based was also the author of the Planet of the Apes, and he was French. So he was a Frenchman who had lived in Southeast Asia, which was at the time a French colony. Um, so he had some experience of the war, but it was a very different experience, and this experience was reflected in the movie. Now, the French officers who were in Indochina at the time, many of them chose to collaborate with the Japanese because their country had surrendered. So we have the surrender of France, and we have Pétain who takes over power, uh, and the colonies are asked to collaborate with the Axis power, Germans, Japanese, whatever. Um, so his image of this, collaboration comes from uh, seeing what the French officer did. It had nothing to do with the British. And in this connection, it's important to say that both the collaboration, as depicted in the movie, and the conditions of the prisoners were fictitious. Now, the book by Boulle was published in French in 1952. And it sold very well. I mean, it sold 6,000 copies every year, which is not a big success. Things changed in 1958, but these things changed in 1958 because the movie was out. So, I mean, one question for me, and I would be interested if anybody know to see in the comments what people think of that, would be what made people choose this particular book to turn into a movie, given that it was not a big success, and also the topic of the book was somehow exotic, outside the usual topics chosen by Hollywood at the time regarding the Second World War. And now, Pierre Boulle, being a quite accomplished writer, his narrative here, as in the Planet of the Apes, is not simple. It's not just a story about a war. It goes deeper. In what ways? I'm going to quote Watt now, who has some really nice thoughts on this topic. So let's look at number 6. Nicholson embodied the social paradox of how the military tends to generate its own objective. So it's a kind of dystopian topic what we have here, that people lose control of what's really happening. Objectives which are often quite in conflict with the original purpose of the institution. So obviously, the original purpose of the institution was to win a war, but eventually these men end up doing the exact opposite, and they end up doing the exact opposite through a very logical process. If you look at Nicholson, how he argues in the movie, Geneva Conventions, we surrendered, we have a military obligation, we should keep up the morale of the men. He gives very good reasons if you look at them in isolation, leaving aside the general context of the war, why they should collaborate with the Japanese. So again, I'm quoting what now? The question arises: how can Boulle have imagined that Nicholson can get away with his love affair for a Japanese bridge? And what continues here? The answer is that Boulle was writing a fantasy and knew it, and that his whole point was with the absurdity of the action. Again, if you think of the Planet of the Apes and absurdity, it makes a lot of sense. It's the same writer. The movie's air of pseudo-reality was also inevitably enforced by its medium. So a movie and a book are two different things, and the point of um, what here is that the book had subtleties and nuances that were lost in the movie. No one reading Bull could have failed to notice from his style alone that the book aimed at ironic fantasy, and it was not some kind of detailed historical realism. Now, the British audience, as I said earlier, was annoyed, outraged by the movie because they thought that people would confuse it for reality, and that's something that happens a lot when you have a movie. Okay, even when people tell themselves this is not an accurate depiction of what happened, um, at the back of their mind they're still seeing this as some sort of reality. By the way, a good example of this would be the movie by Eisenstein, or Eisenstein as he's pronounced in Russia, about the October Revolution, and actually the scenes from this movie are often presented in other movies as a documentary almost of how the storming of the Winter Palace took place, which is actually not true. It was not an accurate historical depiction of the event. Uh, and so, once you turn a novel into a movie, there are a lot more people who are likely to think this reality, unlike a novel. Right? It's almost taken as kind of a photographic evidence of what happened. Now, the last thing I'd like to mention, and there are many things to say about this movie, but the last thing I'd like to say is that again, Lean is a very interesting director. People should look him up. He also did Lawrence of Arabia and many other of these epic war movies, Doctor Zhivago as well. But in his early career, he did other very different movies, so he had a big range. And what I want to say, yeah, one of his earlier movies is Brief Encounter, which is also considered a very important movie. Now, many people are admirers of Lin, especially his flawless style, his ability to make the viewer get captured by the movie. Like you really feel um, everything is happening the right way. Um, it's really successful as entertainment, I would have to say. Now, and one of the major influences here is Spielberg, who acknowledged this. And I have to say, like, watching this movie, especially the parts in the jungle and the action scenes, they often remind me of Indiana Jones, but for the wrong reason, right? I mean, it's really that Indiana Jones has taken ideas from this movie rather than the other way around, obviously. So, okay, that's all I have to say about this. I hope it's useful for some people and hope to see you soon.